The night my brother told me he'd gotten my fiancée pregnant, my mother's first question wasn't whether it was true, it was whether I could keep my voice down. I was standing in my parents' kitchen, still holding the little velvet box with the upgraded diamond I'd bought to surprise Rachel that weekend, and every person I loved most in the world was already deciding, in real time, that I was the problem in the room. That was the night I finally understood something I'd spent 31 years refusing to see. My family had a favorite, and it had never, not once, been me. My name is Daniel. Growing up, I was the reliable one, which in my house was another way of saying the invisible one. My younger brother Jason was the golden child, the one who lit up a room, the one my parents talked about like he was a miracle they'd been personally blessed with. Jason was charming. I'll give him that. He could walk into a disaster he'd created and walk out with everyone thanking him for the privilege. When we were kids, if Jason broke something, I was the one asked why I hadn't been watching him. If Jason failed a class, it was because the teacher didn't understand his gifts. If I got straight A's, my father would nod and say, "Good, now help your brother." I learned early that love in my family was a fixed amount, and Jason had been handed nearly all of it before I was old enough to ask for any. So, I stopped asking. I got quiet. I got useful. I got good at building things, because a thing you build doesn't care who your parents love more. By the time I was 31, I had my own small contracting crew, a truck with my name on the door, and a woman I was going to marry. Her name was Rachel. And God, I loved her. I loved her in the stupid, all-in, no parachute way you only get to love someone once. Before life teaches you to hold a little back. We met on a job. I was renovating the dental office where she worked the front desk, and she brought me coffee I didn't ask for, and stayed late talking to me about nothing until nothing became everything. I proposed on a Tuesday because I couldn't wait for a better day. She cried. She said yes. And for about 8 months, I honestly believed the universe had finally decided to deal me one good hand. I should have known better. Good hands don't get dealt to men like me without a catch somewhere in the deck. The catch, it turned out, was my own brother. Here's the part that still makes my jaw tighten when I think about it. I was the one who introduced them. I brought Rachel to Sunday dinner to meet the family, so proud, so sure they'd finally see that I'd done something right. And Jason turned that 1,000-watt smile on her across the table, and I watched my parents fall in love with her the way they'd never fallen in love with anything I'd brought home, and I thought, good, let them like her. Let them see. I was too busy being grateful to notice that my brother had already started counting the days until he could take her too. Because that was the thing about Jason. He didn't want things because he wanted them. He wanted them because they were mine. It happened slowly, the way these things do. So slow you can convince yourself you're imagining it. Rachel started staying later at my parents' house after dinners, helping my mom in the kitchen, laughing at Jason's jokes a beat too long. Jason started showing up at places he had no reason to be. A text here, an inside joke there I wasn't part of. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that after a lifetime of coming second, of course I'd flinch at the idea of coming second in this too. I told myself my brother would never. My fiancé would never. I trusted them because the alternative was a version of my life I could not survive looking at directly. And so for months I helped them lie to me, just by needing so badly to believe. Then came that night in the kitchen. It was 3 weeks before the wedding. I'd driven over to my parents' house to drop off a chandelier I'd fixed for my mother, and I came in through the garage like I always did, and I heard my brother's voice in the kitchen saying my name in a tone I'd never heard him use. Low. Serious. Jason was never serious. I stopped in the hallway, and I listened, and that was when my whole life quietly came apart at the seams. Rachel's pregnant, he was saying. It's mine, Mom. It happened once, it was a mistake, but she's keeping it, and Dan can't find out like this. I stood in that dark hallway holding a chandelier like an idiot, and I felt the floor tilt under me. Once. He said it happened once. He said it like that made it smaller. Like the size of the betrayal was measured in how many times, and not in the fact that my brother had been inside the woman I was 3 weeks from marrying, and that there was now a child, and that they had all clearly known before I did. Because that was the part that gutted me. The way my mother said, all right, let me think, in the voice of a woman who had heard bad news but not shocking news. This wasn't a bomb going off, this was a plan being managed. When I walked into that kitchen, the three of them turned to look at me, and I watched something happen on my mother's face that I will remember on my deathbed. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't horror at what her sons had come to. It was calculation. She looked at me, the wronged son, the son standing there with his heart in his hands, and the very first thing out of her mouth was, "Daniel, please, keep your voice down, your father's asleep." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "This is unforgivable. Keep your voice down." As if my pain was a noise complaint. As if the most reasonable thing in this situation was for me to be quiet about it. And Jason, my brother, he had the nerve to step toward me with his hands up like I was the dangerous one, like I was the unstable element that needed managing, and he said, "Dan, buddy, let's talk about this like adults." I remember laughing. This ugly, broken sound I didn't recognize. I asked one question. I looked at my mother and I asked, "How long have you known?" And she couldn't meet my eyes. That was my answer. They'd known for weeks. They'd sat across from me at dinner, passed me the potatoes, asked about my work, all while carrying this thing they'd already decided I didn't get a vote in. My father came downstairs then, in his robe, and I thought, okay, here it is, here's the one person who might stand up for me. My father had never been warm, but he was fair. Or I'd spent my life pretending he was. He looked at the scene, he understood it in about 4 seconds, and he said the words that ended my family for me. He said, "Daniel, your brother made a mistake, but that baby is a Whitmore. We're not going to tear this family apart over your pride. Your pride." That's what he called it. Not my heart, not my betrayal, my pride. As if wanting to not be cheated on by my brother and lied to by my parents was a character flaw I needed to work on. As if the reasonable, mature, loving thing to do was to step aside quietly so that Jason and Rachel could raise their baby with the family's blessing, and I could go be sad somewhere it wouldn't inconvenience anyone. And Rachel, where was Rachel in all this? You're wondering. She wasn't even there that night. She was at her apartment, waiting, I later learned, for a phone call to tell her how it went. She let them tell me. She let my mother and my brother break the news like I was a business account being closed. When I finally drove to her place at 2 in the morning, shaking, she opened the door already crying, already halfway through the apology she'd rehearsed, and the first full sentence she said to me was, "I never meant for you to find out this way. Not I never meant to do it. Not I'm so sorry, Daniel." She was sorry about the delivery. Everyone in my life that night was sorry about the delivery, and not one of them was sorry about the betrayal. I gave the ring back to myself, if that makes sense. I put the velvet box in my truck's glove box and I drove until the sun came up, and somewhere around dawn on a county road I didn't recognize, I stopped crying and something in me went very, very cold. Here's what I want you to understand. Because it matters for everything that comes after. I didn't scream. I didn't put my brother through a wall. Though God knows my hands remembered how to make a fist, I didn't burn anything down. I have thought 1,000 times about why, and the truest answer I have is this. A lifetime of coming second had taught me one skill my brother never had to learn: patience. Jason had never once had to wait for anything. Everything he ever wanted had been handed to him warm, and so he had no idea, none, what a man is capable of when he spent 30 years learning to swallow things and wait. My father called it my pride like it was small. He had no idea what he'd just handed me, because a man with nothing left to protect and a very long memory is the most dangerous thing there is. The wedding still happened. Of course it did. 6 months later, not the wedding I'd planned but a new one, Jason and Rachel, in my parents' backyard, the same fairy lights I'd strung up the previous summer for a barbecue still hanging in the trees. I wasn't invited, which I found out from a cousin who assumed I already knew. The family had decided, in the gentle unspoken way families decide these things, that it would be less awkward if I simply wasn't there. Less awkward for them. My mother sent me one text about it. She wrote, "I hope one day you'll understand we did what was best for the baby." The baby. Always the baby. This child I'd never met. Wielded like a shield over every terrible thing they'd done. I didn't reply. I was already 300 miles away by then, in a new city, sleeping on a job site cot in a house I was flipping, working 18-hour days because work was the only thing that didn't lie to me. And that's where the story would end, if this were just a story about a man who got his heart broken. A sad story. A forgettable one. But it's not. Because of what I did in those 4 years, everyone assumed I spent licking my wounds. I built. I'd had my own small crew before. Now I had nothing to go home to and no reason to ever stop, and it turns out that's a kind of fuel most men never get access to. I took every job. I underslept. I underpaid myself. I put every dollar back into the business, and within 2 years my one truck became 6. I stopped flipping houses and started buying them, then buying the notes on them, learning the part of the business the guys with dirty hands never learn, the paper side, the money side, the quiet side where fortunes actually move. I got good at reading a distressed asset. I got good at spotting a man who had borrowed against something he loved, to prop up something that was already dying. I got very, very good at buying that man's debt for pennies and simply, patiently, waiting. There was one deal, about 2 years in, that taught me who I'd become. An older contractor, a good man, had borrowed against his shop to save it and lost anyway, and I bought his note, and when I walked into his office to introduce myself as the new holder, I watched his hands shake, and I did something I hadn't planned. I tore the personal guarantee in half in front of him and told him to keep the shop and pay me when he could. He cried. He asked why. And I heard myself say, because somebody should get a break from a man who's holding their whole life in his hands, and I drove away understanding that I wasn't a cruel person. I was just a person who had finally stopped being helpless, and that those are two very different things people love to confuse. I almost called Rachel that night. I sat in a parking lot with her old number half dialed, 4 years of silence and a swallowed apology sitting in my chest, and then I put the phone down, because I had nothing to say to her that wouldn't cost me the calm I'd built. I told myself that chapter was closed. I had no idea it was about to be ripped open by the one thing I'd never let myself imagine. I didn't know yet that the most distressed asset in the entire state, the one man drowning in debt he'd borrowed against everything he owned, was my own father. Here's what I'd missed. 300 miles away with my head down. While I was building, my family was quietly rotting. It started, as it always did, with Jason. Jason had never held a job longer than the length of my parents' patience with his excuses. But now Jason had a wife and a baby and a lifestyle to fund, and my parents, who had spent their whole lives unable to tell that boy no, co-signed. They co-signed the car. They co-signed the house Jason and Rachel bought that they could not remotely afford. When Jason's businesses failed, and they always failed, my father covered the losses, then borrowed to cover the losses, then borrowed against the family home, the hardware store he'd run for 30 years, his retirement, all of it, to keep the golden child gleaming. My father, the man who lectured me about pride, was hollowing out his entire life to keep my brother from ever having to feel like a failure. And Jason, of course, had no idea and would not have cared. Jason spent. Jason always spent. That was the machine my family had become. My parents feeding everything they had into the furnace of my brother's ego, and I was the only one who'd ever been made to sit outside it. I found all of this out by accident, and then very much on purpose. A supplier I worked with mentioned that a hardware store 2 counties over from where I grew up was about to go under, an old family place, the owner behind on everything, the bank circling. He said the name of the town and my stomach dropped. He didn't know it was my father's store. I did some digging, the kind you can do when you know the paper side of the business, and what I found took my breath away. My father owed money everywhere. The store. The house. 2 separate second mortgages. And the largest single chunk of it, nearly all of it consolidated, had been quietly bundled and sold off by a regional bank to an investment group that specialized in exactly the kind of distressed local debt I bought all the time. I want you to understand, I didn't set out for this. I didn't scheme my way into my father's finances. Life simply handed me, 4 years later, the deed to the furnace that had burned me. Because that investment group holding my father's debt, the one that would decide whether the Whitmore family kept their home or lost everything, I could buy my way into it. So I did. It took me 8 months and most of the leverage I'd built, but I bought the position. Quietly, through a holding company with a name that meant nothing to anyone. A name that was just my initials rearranged, a little private joke I let myself have. And on a gray Tuesday in the 4th year, I sat in a lawyer's office 300 miles from the town I grew up in, and I signed the papers that made me, on paper, the single largest creditor of my father's entire life. The man who had thrown me out to protect my brother now owed everything he had to me, and he had absolutely no idea. And here's the thing, I still hadn't decided what to do with it. That's the part people never believe. I didn't buy that debt with a plan to destroy them. I bought it because it was the smartest deal in front of me and because some cold, honest part of me needed, to be holding the reins for once in my life. What I would do with those reins, I genuinely did not know. And then Rachel called me. 4 years of silence. And then my phone lit up with a number I deleted, but somehow still knew by heart. I almost didn't answer. I stared at that name for 6 full rings. And then I did, because after everything, I am apparently still a man who picks up when the woman he used to love is crying on the other end of the line. And she was crying. But it wasn't the crying I expected. It wasn't the crying of a woman apologizing. It was the crying of a woman who was terrified. "Daniel," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not hang up. There's something about Lily. Lily, the baby. The baby that had been used as a shield to justify blowing up my entire life, and now she had a name, and she was 4 years old, and Rachel was saying that name to me in a voice that made every hair on my body stand up. What about her?" I said. And Rachel said the sentence that turned the entire story inside out. She said, "Daniel, I think she's yours. I need you to sit down for this next part, because it took me a long time to get it straight in my own head. Do you remember the timeline they gave me that night in the kitchen? It happened once. A mistake. Rachel's pregnant. It's mine. That's what Jason said. Here's what actually happened. The truth Rachel had been carrying like a stone for 4 years. Rachel and I had been together, obviously. We were engaged. 2,400 days. And in the weeks before everything fell apart, before she and Jason ever crossed a line, she and I had conceived a child, mine, without either of us knowing yet. Then the affair with Jason started, brief and stupid and driven by my brother's relentless need to take anything that was mine. And when Rachel realized she was pregnant, Panicked, ashamed, in over her head, she and Jason did the math wrong, or did it the way that was most convenient, and decided the baby was his. It fit the story they needed. It fit the drama that would let my mother swoop in and manage everything. A baby conceived in an affair was a scandal the family could organize around. A baby that was actually mine, conceived with my own fiancé, that would have meant they'd thrown out the rightful father to hand his child to the man who stole her. That was a truth no one in my family could afford, so nobody looked too closely. Nobody ordered a test. Why would they? The story was already written and everyone had a part they liked. But Rachel knew. Not for certain, not then. But she knew there was a real chance, and she buried it. Because admitting it meant admitting she'd let the family exile the actual father of her child. And for 4 years, she watched. She watched Lily grow, and she watched that little girl look less and less like Jason and more like a man 300 miles away who didn't know she existed. Lily had my mother's chin, Rachel said. My real mother, not the woman who raised me, the grandmother Lily would never meet. Lily had my exact laugh. This specific hiccuping laugh that Rachel said she'd fallen in love with in me, and now heard every day coming out of a 4-year-old. And the marriage, Rachel's marriage to my brother, was exactly the disaster anyone with eyes could have predicted. Jason didn't want a family. Jason wanted a trophy and a support system. And when Rachel became a tired mother instead of an exciting conquest, he did what Jason does. He lost interest. He drank. He disappeared for days. He ran through my parents' money and my parents' patience and started, Rachel told me, treating Lily with a coldness that broke something loose in her, because on some level Jason had always half known that little girl wasn't his, and he resented her for it without ever once doing the one test that would have told him the truth. So there it was. The child they'd used to justify destroying me was, in all likelihood, mine. My daughter, 4 years old. Being raised in the wreckage of my brother's ego, by a man who resented her, in a house my parents had mortgaged their entire lives to keep afloat, a mortgage that I, through a holding company named after my own initials, now owned. Let me tell you what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph. Everyone expects triumph. What I felt was grief so total it had no bottom. 4 years. 4 years of a little girl's life, her first words, her first steps. The first time she laughed that hiccuping laugh, all of it stolen from me by people who'd rather sacrifice a child's father than admit they were wrong. I didn't want to win anymore. I wanted those 4 years back, and no amount of leverage in the world could buy me those. So I did the only thing I could do. I told Rachel to get the test. A real one, legal, chain of custody, the kind that holds up. I paid for it. I flew her and Lily to a lab in a neutral city so my family wouldn't catch wind of it, and I want to be honest with you about the fear, because it was enormous. Some part of me wanted it to not be true, because if it was true, it meant a real child, a real person, had been suffering in that house while I was 300 miles away nursing my grievances and buying debt. And another part of me wanted it to be true so badly I could barely breathe. Because I had spent 4 years being told the baby was the reason I lost everything. And here was the universe whispering that the baby might be the reason I got a family after all. And here's the detail that still keeps me up. While Rachel and I were arranging that test in secret, Jason was posting photos online of a fishing trip, grinning, the golden child, not a care in the world, and my parents were commenting how proud they were. They had no idea the ground was already gone from under them. That's the thing nobody tells you about patience. The people who wronged you keep smiling right up until the second it lands, and there is a specific loneliness in being the only person in a photograph who knows the truth. I saved that photo, not out of spite. I saved it to remind myself that appearances are the cheapest thing a family can afford, and mine had spent everything on them. The results took 9 days. I didn't sleep for most of them. And on the 9th day, Rachel sent me a photo of a single sheet of paper, and I read the number, 99.99%, and I sat down on the floor of my office and I cried like I have never cried in my life, before or since. She was mine. Lily was mine. My daughter. Now, here is where you find out what 4 years of patience actually buys a man, because I could have called my parents and screamed the truth at them. I could have shown up at that backyard and detonated it. But I'd learned something in 4 years of moving quietly. The loudest revenge is almost never the most complete one. So I made a plan, and I ran it like the best job I'd ever built, one careful stage at a time. First, I made sure Rachel and Lily were safe and provided for, no matter what happened next. Whatever Rachel had done to me, and it was a lot, she was the mother of my child and she was the one who'd finally told the truth when telling it cost her everything. I quietly rented her a place in my city, in my name, and I told her that when she was ready to leave my brother, there was a door already open, no strings, for her and for our daughter. That wasn't for her, entirely. That was for Lily. Second, I got a lawyer, a real one, the expensive kind, and we prepared everything, the DNA results, a custody filing, and, sitting in a folder all its own, The complete documentation of every dollar of my father's debt that I now controlled. Then, and only then, I went home. I hadn't set foot in that town in 4 years. My parents didn't know I was coming. Rachel had told them she was taking Lily to visit a friend, and instead she'd driven her to a park 2 towns over, where I got to meet my daughter for the very first time. I'm not going to try to describe that to you. Some things you don't hand to strangers. I'll only say that Lily looked up at me with my own mother's chin, and my own hiccuping laugh, and she asked if I was the man who was going to fix everything, because that's apparently what Rachel had told her, that a man was coming who fixed things, and I had to turn away so a 4-year-old wouldn't see her father come apart. Then I drove to my parents' house. Sunday dinner. Of course it was Sunday dinner. The whole rotten machine still ran on schedule. I walked in through the garage, same as always. And I stood in the same kitchen where they'd told me to keep my voice down 4 years before, and I watched every face at that table go white. Jason. My mother. My father, older now, grayer. A man clearly being eaten alive by money troubles he didn't understand the source of. My mother stood up and started with, "Daniel, what a surprise, we should have." And I held up one hand, and she stopped, because there was something in my face that told her this was not that kind of visit. I didn't yell. I want you to know that. I have replayed this moment more times than I can count, and I never once raised my voice. I set a folder on the dinner table, right on top of the pot roast, and I said, "I'm going to tell you all some things, and then I'm going to leave. And how the rest of your lives go depends entirely on how you behave in the next 10 minutes. I told them about the debt first. I watched my father's face as he understood, slowly and then all at once, that the mysterious out-of-state investment group that held the note on his house, his store, his entire life, was his older son. The son he'd thrown out. The son whose heart he'd called pride. I watched him realize that everything he owned, he now owed to me, and I watched my mother reach for his hand, and I felt nothing, which surprised me, because I'd expected to feel something. Then Jason, always Jason, had to open his mouth. He said, "So what, you're going to take Mom and Dad's house? That's your big revenge, throwing out your own parents?" And he actually smiled, this smug, familiar smile, so certain even now that he'd land on his feet the way he always had, that the world would rearrange itself to protect him one more time. And that's when I opened the second folder. I looked at my brother and I said, "No, Jason, taking the house would be small. I'm here about your daughter." And I set the DNA results on the table. 99.99%. I watched my brother read it. I watched him not understand it, then go a color I've never seen a human face go. Lily wasn't his. Lily had never been his. The child he'd built his whole false victory on. The baby my parents had used to justify exiling me. The shield they'd all hidden behind for 4 years, was mine. And every single one of them had known, on some level, that the timeline was too clean, that no one had ever ordered a test, that they'd all agreed not to look, because looking might cost them the story they preferred. My mother started crying and saying it couldn't be, and I slid the lab's contact information across the table and told her she was welcome to verify it herself, that I'd already had it done twice. My father said my name, just Daniel, in a voice I hadn't heard from him ever, a small voice, a begging voice, and I realized he wasn't begging about Lily. He was begging about the house. Even now, even in that moment, the man's first fear was still money. And Jason, my brother, the golden child, the one who'd never had to wait for anything in his life, looked around that table for the person who was going to fix this for him, the way people had fixed everything for him since the day he was born. And for the first time in 30 years, there was no one. My mother was staring at a DNA test. My father was staring at bankruptcy. And I was standing in the doorway with my keys already in my hand. Because I'd meant it, I was going to say my piece and leave. So I said my piece. I told them that Rachel and Lily were leaving, that they were coming with me, that I would be filing for custody and that I would win. Because a resentful stepfather, who wasn't even the father, and a set of grandparents who'd hidden a child from her own dad, do not make a compelling case in front of a judge. I told my father that I wasn't going to throw them out of their house. I let that land, watched the flicker of relief, and then I told him the rest. I said I wasn't going to throw them out because I wanted them to stay in it. I wanted them to live every single day in a home they only kept because of the son they discarded, paying a mortgage to a company named after my initials, knowing that the roof over their heads existed purely because I allowed it to. I said, "You told me a family shouldn't be torn apart over one man's pride. You were right. It shouldn't. So look around at what your pride tore apart, because it was never mine. It was yours." And then I picked up my folders, and I left the pot roast steaming on the table, and I walked out through the same garage I'd walked in through 4 years before, except this time I wasn't holding a chandelier, and I wasn't shaking. This time I was holding the keys to a car where my daughter was waiting. The custody case went exactly the way my lawyer said it would. Jason didn't even fight it, in the end. Why would he? He'd never wanted Lily, he'd wanted a prize, and the prize had turned out to belong to me all along. He signed the papers, relinquishing a girl he'd called his daughter for 4 years without so much as a phone call afterward. And if you want to understand my brother completely, understand that. Rachel and I did not get back together. I want to be clear about that. Because people always ask, always want the fairy tale. Too much had happened. Some bridges, once you've watched them burn, you don't rebuild, you just learn to live on your side of the river. But we made peace. For Lily's sake. Real peace. The co-parenting kind. And Rachel got out from under my brother, and out from under my family and started becoming someone I could respect again. Which was its own quiet kind of ending. My parents still live in that house. They send me letters now. My mother mostly. Long ones. Full of the apologies that were 4 years too late. Apologies about the betrayal this time, and not just the delivery. I read them. I don't always answer. I'm not a cruel man, whatever this story might make you think, but I'm also done setting myself on fire to keep that family warm. They made their furnace. They can sit in it. And Lily is 6 now. She has my mother's chin and my hiccuping laugh and a bedroom full of things I built for her with my own hands, and she has no memory of the house she came from, and I intend to keep it that way for as long as I can. The other night she asked me if she'd always lived with me, and I said no. Sweetheart, I found you a couple of years ago, and she thought about that and said, like a treasure. And I said yes. Exactly like a treasure. People hear this story and they call it revenge, and I let them, because it's easier than the truth. The truth is, I never wanted to destroy anyone. I wanted a family. I spent 31 years being told there wasn't enough love in mine to go around, that it had all been spoken for before I arrived, and I believed it. Right up until a 2 a.m. phone call taught me that the whole time, unknowing, I'd had a family of my own out there, a little girl with my laugh, waiting in a house full of people who'd chosen to lose her rather than admit they were wrong. So no, my family had a favorite, and it was never me. But I have a favorite now. She's 6 years old, and she is the reason I know, finally and for certain, that I was never the problem in that kitchen. I was just the only one in the room who understood how to wait.